The sun beat down on the Texas dust as the German POW stepped off the transport truck, his boots cracking from weeks of forced march. He squinted, not at barbed wire or bayonets, but at a line of Willie's jeeps, hoods popped, engines steaming. Nearby, a group of American GIs in cowboy hats leaned against a fence, arms folded, watching. One of them tipped his hat and called out, "You boys know how to fix a carburetor?" The POW froze. He had braced for interrogation, for humiliation, for punishment. Instead, he was handed a wrench. His hands trembled, not from fear, but confusion. Back home, surrender had meant disgrace. Here, it meant labor, but also trust. No guard barked orders, no rifles loomed, just a broken-down engine and a stranger offering tools instead of threats. He looked at the Jeep, then at the cowboy's steady eyes. This wasn't what the Reich had promised. And as the socket clicked onto the bolt, he realized something deeper than metal was being rebuilt. The train clattered to a halt, its brakes squealing in protest against the weight of history it carried. A tattered silence enveloped the men as the heavy steel doors were flung open. The air outside was thick with heat and the smell of the dry Texas earth, a far cry from the acrid smoke of the cities they had left behind. They had traveled for days through shattered Germany across the land of the defeated, Munich, Bremen, Dresden. The memories were still sharp, vivid, like the scattered images of a nightmare that wouldn't fade. Their hands were raw from the chains that had bound them, their bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion. They had been conscripts, mechanics, engineers, men who knew the delicate balance between a wrench and a detonator. Now they were little more than shells of soldiers, huddled together in the cargo hold of a train, unsure of what awaited them. Each of them held on to different rumors, whispers from fellow prisoners or muttered warnings from officers. "The Americans will shoot us on sight," one man had said. "They'll make us dig our own graves." Another swore that they'd be tortured, made to suffer for the crimes of the Reich. And then there were the stories about the Cowboys, rumors of men in wide-brimmed hats who would brand them like cattle, who would treat them as less than human. These were the stories that clung to the POWs like the dust in the air, suffocating them as the train rattled on. But when the train finally halted and the doors were flung open to a new world, the men were faced with a confusion far more disorienting than the fear that had gripped them for so long. The barbed wire wasn't jagged and imposing. It was neat, orderly. The guards who waited on the other side didn't sneer or shout. They didn't even carry their rifles in the way they expected. Instead of demanding them to kneel or to stand in line, one guard, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a cowboy hat, approached with something entirely unexpected, a pair of gloves. "You're gonna need these," he said in a slow drawl, handing them over as though he were offering a gift, not an order. The POWs stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or cry. They had been told that surrender meant disgrace, that they were to be broken and humbled by their captors. But this was different. They were led across the camp in silence, the sound of boots against dry earth, the only noise that filled the air. The camp was vast, stretching out before them like an endless expanse of nothingness. There were no watchtowers, no dogs, no soldiers barking orders. It was as if they had entered a new reality. The land here didn't feel like the enemy's territory. The terrain was flat, unremarkable, yet strangely welcoming. The vast openness of it was unsettling in its own way. There was no looming threat in the distance, no wall of concrete to press against. Just wide, open fields, the smell of hay on the wind, and the hum of everyday life. The men were processed quickly, their names taken down, their numbers catalogued. But it was all so calm, so methodical. There was no hysteria, no cruelty. It was almost as if they were being treated with civility. For the POWs, that was the first shock. After months of being pushed from one hellhole to another, they were suddenly surrounded by order, by silence, by something that felt like a twisted version of peace. Their expectations had been shattered. It was all so different from the images they had carried in their minds of what America was, what their captors were. They were told America was a land of barbarism, of raw power, of men who would stop at nothing to destroy the enemy. Yet here, in the middle of nowhere, they were treated with a kind of neutrality that felt more dangerous than any violence could have. Some of them expected to be crushed, but instead they were offered something far more disorienting: humanity. Yet, as they stood in line, waiting for the mess hall to open, their senses were assaulted not by the sour tang of mildew or the acrid smell of sweat that had clung to them for weeks, but by something altogether different: the rich, savory aroma of meat sizzling over an open flame. It was the smell of warmth, of comfort, something these men had not experienced in months. The camp's mess hall was unlike anything they had expected. Instead of the gruff, hostile environment they had braced for, they were greeted by cheerful chatter, clinking plates, and the hum of American soldiers serving food with the ease of men who were accustomed to this. The POWs shuffled forward, eyes wide, minds still processing the sudden shift from fear to confusion. One of the American guards, a lanky man in his late 20s, smiled at them without mockery. Just a curious kindness. "Get yourself some grub," he said, gesturing toward the serving line. They had expected bread crusts and watery soup, like the scraps they had been fed on the long journey here. Instead, they found a feast: cornbread, potatoes, beef stew, and thick, juicy steaks. They hesitated, some unsure whether it was real or just another trick. For so long, their stomachs had been hollow, filled only with the gnawing pain of hunger. They had survived on whatever they could scrounge, meager rations often supplemented with grass or bark. In the freezing winters of Germany, they scraped together what little they could to stay alive, and now they were handed something more than they ever imagined. One man's hands trembled as he reached for his plate, unsure whether to take the food, whether it might be poisoned. But hunger, as it always does, won out. They took their trays and sat at long tables, exchanging glances, unsure how to respond. It was absurd. After everything they had been through, this was the last thing they had expected. The first bite was overwhelming, salty, rich, and deeply satisfying. The food wasn't just filling their stomachs, it was filling the empty spaces inside them that had been hollowed out by war, fear, and hunger. It wasn't just the steak. It was the unexpected kindness, the fact that their captors were treating them like human beings. The GIs who served them didn't scowl or sneer, they didn't treat them like animals. They simply did their job, offering food as if it were nothing extraordinary. They watched the POWs eat, perhaps amused by the hesitant, almost reverent way the men picked up their forks, unsure of their right to consume what was before them. Some ate quickly, almost greedily, while others stared at their plates, unsure whether to believe the reality of the moment. The meal wasn't just food. It was a moment of humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there could be light. The guards didn't shout or order them around. Instead, they leaned against the counter, talking quietly among themselves, watching the POWs eat. It was a strange kind of peace, one that felt foreign and unsettling. How could they be treated with this care when just days earlier they had been treated as tools of war, as enemies to be crushed? For some of the men, it was a moment of realization. The enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear. These were men, just like them. Though they were on opposite sides of a war, they shared a common need: food, warmth, survival. It was a small, quiet moment, but in it something had shifted. They were no longer just prisoners. For the first time since their capture, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: the spark of life. The next morning, a new kind of silence fell over the camp. It wasn't the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle with tension, but the kind that settles like dust after a storm, an uneasy calm. The POWs were told to gather in the motor pool area, where the smell of oil and gasoline filled the air and the sound of metal clinking against metal was the dominant noise. The area itself was unremarkable, a patch of dirt surrounded by a few makeshift sheds, but it wasn't where they had expected to be. There, standing by a line of jeeps, was a man in a grease-streaked uniform holding a clipboard. "Need some mechanics," the American said, glancing up at them. "Any of you know your way around an engine?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what to make of the question. Most had never been asked what they knew before. They were soldiers, not technicians. Some had worked with U-boats, others on trucks, tanks, or warplanes. This wasn't a demand. They were being offered a chance, however small, to do something other than fight, to prove their worth. One man, a former factory mechanic from Bremen, stepped forward, his voice steady but uncertain. "I can work on a car," he said. The American guard nodded. "Good. Let's see what you've got." They were assigned to teams, each given a vehicle or piece of machinery to repair. The realization came quickly. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't work in the traditional sense. It was simply a job. They were tasked to fix things, to use their skills to restore, not destroy. They were given wrenches and screwdrivers, tools they had once been denied. For the first time in months, their hands were free. Their hands, once bound by the chains of war, could twist bolts and turn gears. They could be who they had been before the war: craftsmen, engineers, technicians. As the days passed, the POWs settled into a rhythm. They worked with a precision honed on war machines. Each twist of the wrench felt like a small victory. Each engine they fixed a sign of their regained identity. The guards didn't rush them, didn't bark orders. They stood by, observing with quiet interest. Some even offered cigarettes as the POWs worked. It wasn't charity, it was recognition, acknowledgement that their skills mattered. One afternoon, a jeep broke down just outside the motor pool. The engine sputtered and died, and the American soldiers stood nearby, unsure of what to do. Without thinking, a German POW from a small town near Nuremberg walked up to the jeep, looked under the hood, and immediately began assessing the problem. No one told him to do it. No one ordered him. He simply did it. When the engine roared back to life, the soldiers gave him a nod, a small gesture that spoke volumes. He had been trusted with something vital, and he had succeeded. As they spent more time in the motor pool, the POWs began to realize just how much the Americans valued their skills. They weren't there to be punished. They were there to help. The tools weren't locked away or guarded by soldiers. The sheds where the equipment was stored weren't constantly watched. For the first time in a long time, they were treated like human beings, capable of something more than just surviving. They were allowed to work, trusted to get the job done. No chains, no guards hovering over them, just wrenches, engines, and the quiet hum of American soldiers in the background. It was a stark contrast to the violence they had known. The first time their hands were unbound, not by physical restraint, but by the opportunity to work, they understood. It wasn't just the engines they were fixing. It was their own sense of self. In the middle of a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, these men had found a new purpose. For the first time in a long time, they were doing something they knew how to do, and doing it well. The days in the motor pool had begun to take on a quiet rhythm. Each time an engine came back to life, each time a Jeep was returned to service, the POWs could feel something small but significant shifting inside them. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about reclaiming their old identities, their skills, the parts of themselves that had been buried under the weight of war. But it wasn't just the work that changed things. It was the way they were treated by the American soldiers, those strange, almost mythical cowboys that guarded them. The term cowboys had become an inside joke among the POWs, but it was more than just a nickname. It was their way of trying to understand the men who guarded them. These were soldiers who wore boots and thick belts, who spoke in slow, drawling tones. Some even rode horses through the camp, a sight that seemed more like something out of a Western film than reality. To the POWs, these men seemed like a parody of themselves, so different from the cold, faceless soldiers they had fought against. At first, they viewed them with skepticism, even fear. They were told that the Americans would be brutal, that their captors would treat them with contempt. But the reality was far stranger. These men were calm, relaxed, sometimes even friendly. They weren't soldiers like the ones who had torn through Europe with hate in their eyes. These were men who seemed almost detached from the war, men who wore the uniform of the enemy but didn't act like it. One afternoon, a Willys Jeep sputtered and broke down just outside the motor pool. The engine gave one last cough, then went silent. The American soldiers nearby exchanged looks of mild confusion, but said nothing. Then, one of them, the eldest of the group, took a long drag from his cigarette and casually waved over a nearby German POW. "Mind taking a look?" he asked, with no mockery, no sarcasm, just a simple question. The German POW froze, confused by the request. He had expected an order, perhaps a sneer or a jeer, but instead he was handed a cigarette and a small nod of acknowledgment. After a moment of hesitation, the POW stepped forward and crouched by the engine. His hands moved instinctively, reaching for the carburetor and quickly assessing the problem. There were no threats, no demands, just a simple task and the trust that he could fix it. The engine came back to life with a satisfying roar, and the cowboy, without a word, gave him a small smile. There was no punishment, no control, just gratitude. It was a moment that felt surreal to the POW, who had expected to be humiliated, not helped. It was a small exchange, but for him, it was profound. As the weeks passed, the relationship between captors and captives began to shift. The POWs who worked in the motor pool found themselves speaking more with the cowboys. Not much, just a few words here and there, but it was enough to break down the wall of suspicion that had defined their existence. It wasn't about friendship or understanding yet, but it was a growing respect. A young cowboy with sandy hair would sometimes ask how to fix a Jeep. Another one, who liked to lean against the motor pool fence, would watch them work with quiet interest, offering a cigarette now and then. Mechanics had become that strange middle ground between enemies, a bridge built not of words, but of tools, trust, and necessity. The POWs no longer felt like mere prisoners. They were valued for what they knew, not what they had fought for. And in that simple recognition, something much larger was being restored, their humanity. And with every Jeep that came back to life, so did a part of them. The first few days in the motor pool had been filled with disbelief, but as time passed, the POWs began to settle into a routine. They were used to working under pressure, accustomed to the rigorous demands of war, where every movement mattered and mistakes were punished swiftly. But here, in the motor pool, it was different. The tools they were given were not rationed or guarded like the precious resources they had known in the camps. Instead, they were handed over freely, without a guard watching their every move. The wrenches, screwdrivers, and spanners were theirs to use, not as a punishment, but as a means to do something real, something meaningful. For the first time, the men were treated not like prisoners to be controlled, but like workers, respected for the skills they brought with them. One German POW, a mechanic from the outskirts of Munich, watched the others with a mix of confusion and resentment. "They're fools," he whispered, glancing at the American guards who stood by, seemingly oblivious to the significance of what was happening. He couldn't understand why the Americans trusted them with such responsibility. Back in Germany, tools had been rationed, hoarded, stolen. The very idea of a tool being freely handed to a prisoner was incomprehensible to him. It felt like weakness, like a mistake that would come back to haunt them. Yet, even as he muttered to himself, a small part of him couldn't help but wonder if there was something deeper at work here, something he couldn't quite grasp. As the weeks passed, the internal struggle began to take root in more of the POWs. They had been taught to believe in their duty to the Reich, to serve the war machine and die for the Empire if necessary. But now, in the motor pool, they were doing something entirely different. They weren't building weapons of destruction. They weren't contributing to the war effort. Instead, they were building motion. They were repairing vehicles that would carry soldiers, not into battle, but into the world after the war. Every turn of the wrench, every spark of the engine was an act of creation, not destruction. They were fixing things, not tearing them apart. For the first time, their work didn't feel like an extension of the war. It felt like a quiet rebellion against it. The mental shift wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The more the POWs worked with their hands, the more they realized that their skills mattered again. They weren't just mechanics in name, they were technicians, engineers, craftsmen who could fix something vital. The American soldiers who stood nearby didn't treat them like enemies, didn't look down on them with disdain. They treated them like professionals, like equals. The recognition they had longed for, but had never expected to receive from their captors, was finally given to them. They were respected for what they knew, for what they could do, not for the uniform they wore or the past they carried. This shift was not without its internal struggles. The men who had once been so fiercely loyal to the Reich now had to reconcile their sense of duty with the reality of their situation. They had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that there was no greater disgrace than being captured. But now, in the motor pool, they were being treated with respect, with dignity. The work they did mattered. They were no longer just soldiers, stripped of their identities. They were human beings again, capable of creating something with their own hands. And it was in those quiet moments under the hoods of jeeps, as the men tightened bolts and fixed engines, that a quiet dignity began to grow. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it was there in the way their hands moved with purpose, in the way they shared tools and exchanged advice. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were men with skills, with knowledge, with worth. It wasn't the kind of dignity that came with power or pride. It was the dignity that came from doing something real, something tangible. And in that simple act of repairing machines, the POWs began to reclaim a small piece of their humanity. As the weeks passed in the motor pool, a strange sense of routine began to take shape. The days stretched on with the hum of engines, the turning of wrenches, and the quiet camaraderie between captors and captives. But there was something else that began to stir beneath the surface, something that neither the repairs nor the camaraderie could touch. It was a longing, an ache, that found its way into letters. The POWs began writing home, though they knew, deep down, that their letters would likely never be sent. "I fixed an American Jeep today," one man wrote in a trembling hand. "They let me use a welding torch." Another confessed, "I haven't felt this useful since 1942. These weren't confessions of betrayal or regret. They weren't admissions of guilt. Instead, they were chronicles of confusion. How could the enemy, these men who had once been painted as monsters, allow them to feel useful again? How could they be treated with such basic respect when they had been told all their lives that to surrender was to disgrace themselves and their country? The letters spoke of small, ordinary things: engines fixed, wrenches turned, days passed. There was no mention of the war, of ideology, of the larger battles that had brought them here. These were simple confessions, nothing more. And yet they were so much more than that. What was unsaid, however, was just as powerful as what was written. They didn't write about the guilt that gnawed at them, the guilt that came with the realization that they were being treated better than they had been taught to expect. They didn't write about the shame they felt, knowing that their families back home were still trapped in a crumbling nation, enduring starvation and the horrors of war. And they certainly didn't write about the identity crisis they were facing. In the silence between the lines, there were questions that went unasked. What had they been fighting for? What had they sacrificed? Were they still the men they had been when they first donned their uniforms? Could they ever return to that world, or had they become something else entirely? One man wrote simply, "I am alive. They feed me. They treat me kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." That letter was never sent. It would be intercepted, read by someone in an office in Berlin, who might wonder what had happened to these men who had been taught to despise their captors. But what it said, what it truly said, was a confession of something deeper, that the war, the world they had once known, had shattered. They didn't know how to make sense of the strange, new world they were living in. But it wasn't just the food or the tools or the lack of cruelty. It was the simple humanity that was being extended to them, even though they were prisoners of war. They had been told that to surrender was to lose everything: their dignity, their honor, their lives. And yet, here they were, not just surviving, but working, creating, living. In the silence between the words, there was a fracture, a crack that was deeper than the physical pain of war. It was the fracture of the soul, the deep, uncomfortable realization that they had been living a lie, that their beliefs, their sense of identity, had been built on false foundations. How could they reconcile this new reality with the war that had defined their lives for so long? They had been told that the enemy was cruel, that surrender was weakness, that to be taken prisoner was the ultimate shame. And yet, here they were, being treated with kindness, with respect, with the simple dignity that had been denied them for so long. The letters they wrote were not just messages to their families, they were messages to themselves. They were trying to understand what had happened to them, what had become of their country, what had happened to their ideals. They wrote, but in their hearts they knew the truth. The letters could never be sent. The war was over for them, but the questions that lingered in the silence between the words would follow them long after they left the camp. The morning air was still cool as the POWs gathered in the motor pool, the early light casting long shadows. When the mechanic from Nuremberg arrived at his station, something caught his eye. A mug of coffee sat beside his toolbox, steam rising in the crisp morning air. His first thought was disbelief. No guard stood nearby. No officer gave orders, just the mug, and beside it a folded note. "Thanks for the work yesterday." The man stared at the coffee. For a moment he thought it might explode in his face. Gratitude was a foreign concept in the world of war. In Germany, on the battlefield, and in the camps, kindness didn't exist between enemies. Soldiers were treated as cogs in a brutal machine, their worth defined by how well they could fight or endure. But here, in this strange place, a cup of coffee had been placed in front of him, as if it were an offering of peace. There was no signature, no demand, just the quiet acknowledgment of his effort. It was a paradox. In a place where he was taught to be nothing but a prisoner, something so small as a cup of coffee showed him he was more than just that. He didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he sat still, the note still in his hand. He turned it over, unsure what to do. Was this a trap? Was the coffee part of some larger strategy to break him down? Or, if it was genuine, what did it mean? How could an enemy, someone he had been taught to hate, treat him with such simple humanity? As the day passed and the tasks in the motor pool continued, the man found himself distracted, returning again and again to that simple act. He couldn't shake the thought. He looked around at the other men, still reluctant to accept the comfort they were being given, but something had shifted inside him. The coffee, the note. It wasn't about the drink itself. It was the recognition that kindness, however small, could break through the walls of war. By the end of the day, when the engines hummed back to life and the jeeps were once again in working order, the mechanic saw the cowboy again, the same man who had placed the coffee on his toolbox that morning. The cowboy tipped his hat to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that brief gesture, the POW realized something fundamental. It wasn't a symbol of superiority, it was a sign of respect. The cowboy wasn't looking down on him or treating him like a prisoner. He was acknowledging his skill, his effort, his humanity. This wasn't just a camp. It wasn't a place of captivity anymore. It was a paradox, a place where the enemy was no longer a faceless villain, but a person capable of understanding, kindness, and respect. The POW was no longer just a prisoner. He had become someone whose work mattered. He wasn't defined by the uniform he wore or the circumstances of his capture. He was a man who had been trusted with something important, and that trust had restored a piece of his dignity. In that moment, the POW understood that he had stepped out of the shadow of war. He had moved beyond just surviving to something more. He wasn't merely a captive anymore. He was a man with purpose. The small gesture of coffee, the simple note, had made him realize he was still seen as human. And in that realization, he knew that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a person again. Time in the camp stretched, its days slipping by in a quiet, slow rhythm. The war had ended, but the POWs remained, still confined behind barbed wire. Germany's surrender had reached them, but it felt distant and unreal in this faraway place. Though the war had ended, they were still stuck in limbo. The prisoners knew that the world had changed, but they were still held by the remnants of that old, brutal reality. In their new, strange life, they began to notice something. Some of the POWs, especially the mechanics, were invited into nearby towns to help with local repairs. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. The civilians needed their skills to rebuild, to fix the things that had been broken by the war. The prisoners weren't forced to work. They were asked. They were given the chance to contribute not as prisoners, but as men with something to offer. It was a strange, new experience, a moment of humanity in a world that had denied them so much. While they worked, they watched. The Americans had a different way of life, a different sense of freedom. In the motor pools, American teenagers worked on trucks as a form of recreation. It was a game, not a necessity. For the POWs, fixing things had always been driven by the need for survival, for efficiency, for the war effort. They had been taught to work quickly and precisely, but here, in the quiet corners of small towns, the young mechanics worked at a slower pace, laughing and joking as they rebuilt what had been destroyed. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about enjoyment, about living without the pressure of war. It was a stark contrast. The POWs couldn't help but feel the weight of this contrast. They had always thought that freedom was about borders being lifted, about the end of conflict. But now they began to see something different. Freedom wasn't just about the absence of war. It was about living without the constant pressure to survive, without the rigidity of purpose that had always defined their existence. It was about being able to create without fear, to work without the shadow of survival hanging over them. They had been taught that their value was tied to their ability to perform, to fix what was broken, to build machines of war. But here, in the freedom of the American way, they saw something else entirely, a world where work was a means of expression, not just survival. This realization broke something open in them. As they worked alongside the young mechanics, they began to question everything they had ever believed. What if freedom wasn't just about borders, about politics, about nations at war? What if it was about something far simpler? What if freedom was about living in a world where your work, your skills, your very existence weren't defined by the constant drive to survive? What if it was about living without fear, without the weight of war? It was a quiet longing that began to grow in their hearts. A longing not just to return home, but to belong to a world that felt open, a world where they weren't just surviving, but living, where they could fix, create, and contribute without the shadow of war. They were still behind the barbed wire. They were still prisoners, but something inside them had changed. They had seen a glimpse of life beyond the camp, a life that was free not just from war, but from the chains of their old identities, their old beliefs. The horizon was no longer just a line beyond the fence. It was a world they could imagine, a world that wasn't limited by borders or survival. And in that quiet moment of realization, they began to understand that true freedom wasn't just about escaping captivity. It was about the possibility of living a life where creativity and humanity could flourish once more. Then the names were called. The ships were ready. The POWs, who had spent so long confined behind barbed wire, were now preparing to return to Germany, a country shattered, starving, and unrecognizable. The war was over, but the sense of finality had not yet settled in. They packed their meager belongings, a wrench, a notebook, a handkerchief from a Texan boy. These small items, symbols of their time in captivity, were the only remnants of a life that felt both distant and real. For so long, survival had been their focus, but now, as they prepared to leave, they were forced to reckon with the men they had become in the camp and what awaited them in the world beyond. The trucks rumbled by, and the jeeps they had worked on for so long rolled past them one last time. Some of the men, their eyes hollow from months of hardship, looked back at the camp. They were going home, but home had changed. The streets and cities they once knew had been reduced to rubble. The families they had fought to protect were now scattered, many of them starving, struggling to survive. They couldn't help but wonder what awaited them. The home they once knew was gone, and the men who had left it would return as strangers. The real war, however, was just beginning. It was no longer a battle fought with weapons, but with identity. How could they reconcile the men they had become with the men they had been? In the camp, they had learned dignity, kindness, and respect, things they had never associated with captivity. But would their fellow countrymen understand that? How could they explain the changes that had taken place inside them when they had been taught all their lives that surrender meant disgrace, that their worth was tied to loyalty and sacrifice. As the ships sailed toward Europe, the men stared at the vast, unbroken sea before them, knowing that their return to Germany would never be as simple as arriving home. The ocean stretched out like a reminder of everything they had left behind and everything they were returning to. Would their families see them as they once were? Or would they see only the men who had been captured, the ones who had surrendered? The fear of not being understood by their own people gnawed at them. How could they explain that their experience in captivity had reshaped them, not just physically, but emotionally? How could they convey that they had learned something beyond survival, beyond duty? They carried their time in captivity with them, not just the wrench or the notebook, but the heavy, invisible weight of all they had experienced, the kindness of their captors, the quiet dignity they had been given, the unexpected humanity. They carried these things deep inside them, unsure how to share them with the world they were returning to. Their transformation wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding what it meant to be human, to be seen as more than just a soldier, more than just a prisoner. The real struggle wasn't just returning to Germany. It was returning to a world that wouldn't understand what they had become. How could they explain that freedom wasn't just about borders? It was about living without fear, without the weight of war. How could they convey that they had found something in captivity that they could never find again in a world shaped by violence and conflict? And so, as they made their way back, the POWs carried with them not only their physical belongings, but the weight of the men they had become. They weren't just returning to a ruined homeland. They were returning to a world that no longer fit them. Years passed, and the quiet hum of the motor pool was now just a distant memory for the German POW. He had returned to his homeland, but it was no longer the world he had left behind. Germany was shattered, its streets filled with rubble, its people starving and broken. The war was over, but the men who had survived it were still grappling with the remnants of what they had become. He had settled in Munich and found work as a mechanic, fixing the very machines that had been part of the destruction he once knew. But the memories from the motor pool in Texas, with those strange men in cowboy hats, had stayed with him, etched in the depths of his mind. One day, as he worked on an old engine in his garage, his young grandson stood beside him, watching with wide eyes. The boy was just beginning to learn the craft of mechanics, eager to fix things and get his hands dirty like his grandfather. "You don't fight an engine," the old man said with a small smile, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You listen to it." The words flowed easily, as natural to him as breathing. He paused, looking at the boy, his eyes momentarily distant. The memories of the dusty motor pool and the quiet trust those American cowboys had placed in him flooded back. "I learned that in Texas," he said softly, "with cowboys." The words surprised him as they left his mouth, but they were true. It wasn't just the mechanics of the work that had shaped him. It was the simple humanity of it all, the way he had been treated with respect, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as someone capable of doing something real, something that mattered. The smell of diesel and dust, the sound of wrenches and engines humming to life, it had all left an imprint on him, one that time could never erase. The boy nodded, taking in every word, his young face focused on the engine before them. But the old man's thoughts drifted back to that time, to the days when he was a prisoner in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies who, in the end, were not so different from him. In that strange motor pool, where work was more than just survival, he had found a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about building weapons of war. It wasn't about destruction. It was about building something, about giving life back to machines that had been broken. The engines he fixed, the jeeps he helped bring back to life, were symbols of something much deeper, his own redemption. The old man's hands moved over the car engine with practiced ease, the motions fluid and natural, as if the years had never passed. He could still smell the dust and diesel from those days in Texas. He could still hear the hum of the engines, the quiet exchanges with those American cowboys who had treated him with something he had never expected: dignity. The thought of them, those men who had trusted him with their tools, who had given him the freedom to repair instead of destroy, left a lasting impression on him, one that had stayed long after the war ended. Not every Jeep he fixed ran forever. Some engines sputtered and died, just as some of the relationships from his past had faded with time. But something inside him had never broken. The trust and dignity he had been shown had built something lasting inside him, a foundation that remained firm, even as the world around him changed. Years later, his grandson would ask about those men, those cowboys. "What happened to them?" the boy would ask, his young voice full of curiosity. The old man would pause, looking at the boy with a soft smile. "Some went home," he would say with a shrug. "Some stayed." The conversation would drift, as it often did, but the memory of those cowboys, those men who had shown him that there was more to life than survival, would live on in the lessons he passed down. The engine roared to life with a satisfying hum, and the old man smiled. He had come full circle. He had crossed a threshold in that motor pool years ago, not just from prisoner to worker, but from someone who had been broken to someone who could rebuild not only machines, but his own sense of self. The past, with all its pain and triumph, was still with him. But so was the lesson, that even in the darkest of times there could be light, there could be humanity, and there could be something more than just survival. And if you've made it this far, tell us where in the world you're watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you heard stories like this before? If you'd like us to keep bringing these forgotten WWII stories to life, make sure to like this video, subscribe below, just scroll under the video player to find the subscribe button, and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. These moments of history matter, and we can keep telling them together.